No, Dan, I think you're absolutely right. It's really quite striking. Suddenly, the whole nuclear business has taken a back seat. And I don't think we should be surprised by it. I think we have to go back to the beginning. Remember the Israeli intelligence projection that after 3 or 4 or 5 days, the Iranian government would probably collapse under the weight of US and Israeli bombing and missiles? That didn't turn out to be the case. And then you have to listen to subsequent arguments made by President Trump over and over again that this country that was supposed to fall apart in 3 or 4 days, in fact, represented an existential threat not just to Israel, but to the United States. Nobody seemed to bother to ask the critical question. If you think this state will only last a few days, or maybe a week or two, then how could it possibly present an existential threat to the United States? Well, he never answered that question, and he had no strategy because the expectation was we bomb, they fold. Now, why would he have ever signed on for that? I think we have to understand that President Trump only knows what he knows. This is not a highly educated man. I don't care how many good schools he supposedly attended. He's no different from many of the people running around in uniform with 4 stars that have never really studied or understood anything about the wars they were fighting. And when that expectation wasn't met, we then backed away from one set of goals to new sets of goals. And at this point, we've essentially thrown away everything else and said what we desperately really want is some way to open the strait. Now, of course, you and I know the straits were open before we bombed, but that's not the point. This has to open as a result of something that Trump does. In other words, it has to open on his terms, which explains why he submitted new terms. When all else fails and you can't make a case, you lie. That's where we are. What else is he going to do? He's going to lie and say, no, we've been successful. How many times does he have to say that? I remember Senator Kerry, not one of my favorite people, but nevertheless, on this occasion, he was honest. He was asked, well, what is General Petraeus going to do when he comes back to report to Congress? And he says, well, that's easy. He's going to report that he's been enormously successful. In other words, the truth is irrelevant. It's getting people back here in the United States, in Washington, and most important on Wall Street, to believe what he wants. Because if he can't do that, he can't manipulate the markets. If you can't manipulate the markets, that means we're in a lot of trouble. Because when the truth comes out, the markets are going to crash. That's something we've lost complete sight of. We're up to 4.5% in the 10-year Treasury bond. Everybody, whether it's Good Luck or Luke Roman or any of the others that have looked at the bond market for years, has said once we hit 5%, which is very, very close, we've had it. We can't service the debt. We default. So I think President Trump has got that in the back of his mind, whatever else he's doing right now. Well, it's something that we've experienced before with any of these air and missile campaigns, that eventually you run out of legitimate military targets. You hit everything and you discover it hasn't made any difference whatsoever. That's when you begin looking for other things. You heard him talk about transportation infrastructure, roads and bridges. He's talked about desalination plants. He's talked about petroleum infrastructure. Why do you do that? You do it because you've run out of other legitimate targets. So that's simply a clear and unambiguous demonstration that the air and missile campaign has failed to deliver. Remember, everything was always predicated on the notion that if you hit enough targets and you hit them long enough, eventually everybody would walk out, cry uncle, and say, please stop, put in front of me whatever you want me to sign, I'll sign it. Well, that's not going to happen because right now, this is analogous to taking a sledgehammer to the Rock of Gibraltar. If you think you're going to knock the Rock of Gibraltar down with a sledgehammer, you're going to be there for quite a while. The short answer is no, of course not. But there are a couple of other things to keep in mind. First, a friend of yours and mine, somebody we both know, Harry Katsianis, wrote a great article, I think it was in 1945. And it's all about the Navy and the fact that the Navy now has more missile launchers and tubes than it has missiles. In other words, our industrial base cannot keep up. It cannot provide enough missiles, enough munitions in a short span of time that would allow us to sustain the war against Iran. And we didn't say win it, but just sustain it. So I don't know how much longer we can continue to hurl munitions and explosives at Iran before we get to the bottom of the barrel. It's sort of like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Eventually, you reach the point where you can't pull any more out. I think we're going to hit that point somewhere along the line in the industrial base with the missile production line. Now, as far as what else could be done, ground troops, it is interesting that he didn't address it because in recent days, you and I know that he has. He brought up that he was considering seizing Clark Island. Of course, his great friend and supporter, Lindsey Graham, chimed in immediately and said, "Oh, yes, we've got to do that. That's the key." We've listened to General Wes Clark, whom I normally regard as highly intelligent and thoughtful, come on board and say, yeah, we're going to hit Clark Island. That's the key to success. I haven't seen any evidence it will make any difference at all, but that's what he's done. And then finally, that great man, General McKenzie, the architect of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, has come on board and said, yes, we should seize Coronado Island. We need to stand on Iranian soil and hold it as a bargaining chip. This sort of stuff is just incredible. First of all, what does anybody think is going to happen if we try to move into southern Iran or in the Persian Gulf? They're going to be hit with everything you can imagine from every angle. You've got a country the size of Western Europe, 93 million people, and hundreds of places from which they can launch unmanned systems like the Shahed drones or various kinds of theater ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Those are going to take a terrible toll. If we have people sitting on this real estate, they're sitting ducks. What are they going to do? Are they going to use the island as a lily pad? This is a sort of marine idea for the Pacific. Well, the problem is it doesn't work because a lily pad can be annihilated. But then you go down to Chabahar. That's come up for discussion too. Oh, let's take Chabahar. That's a city. Well, I think the Iranians are a lot like the Russians were when they retreated in front of Napoleon Bonaparte. They destroyed everything, leaving nothing for the French. They tried to do the same thing in World War II as the Germans advanced into the Soviet Union. The Soviets did. Not quite as successful as Caesar was. But my point is, why would the Iranians sit there and say, okay, fine, let's bargain now. You're sitting on top of Chabahar. And then finally, once you've gotten somebody there, assuming they survive, what are they going to do? Where's this great ground force? How do you get somewhere? Oh, we're going to climb into V-22s and helicopters? Well, I'm sure that'll work very well. What did we see in Isfahan? We saw a very vulnerable special aircraft shot to pieces. Come on. This is different. This is a real war. Either fish or cut bait. And he doesn't want to cut bait. He keeps hooking up new worms to the hook and throwing them overboard, thinking that eventually the fish is going to give up. It's not going to happen. Well, Dan, we need to face the reality that this is effectively what General Keane and others like him have argued for. That is, finish the job. Finish the job amounts ultimately to a relapse into barbarism, descent into the Middle Ages. It means bringing your enemy to his or her knees. That's really what they're saying. In order to do that, in their minds, you're going to have to destroy everything. Most important, not just the petroleum infrastructure, industry, and so forth. You're going to have to destroy the desalination plants. That's how you bring the country, in their minds, to its knees. Now, why is this not likely to work? Well, first of all, I think the Iranians are quite prepared to sustain the damage that he's threatening. They have found ways around it in the past. There are other ways to export petroleum, and they'll do it, and those products. Secondly, while this goes on and President Trump is soothing his ego and postponing the inevitable admission of defeat, which has to happen for this to end, frankly, he's got to say, look, this hasn't worked. We've got to disengage. He doesn't want to do that. His ego won't permit him to do such a thing. That means the rest of the world looks at this and says, we're screwed. We're headed into a global depression. And that's where we're going. When you look at fertilizer and the 40–50% increase in the cost of it, it's not just the cost, it's the availability. The nitrogen that is vital and essential, the helium that you absolutely need for the production of microcircuitry. All of these things fall into the same categories. This is a catastrophe, and it's being brought on not by Iran, contrary to what we think. It's being brought on by us in our unconditional allegiance to Israel, because it is ultimately Israel that demands the destruction of Iran. We have no particular reason why we should destroy the Iranian state or murder most of its population. That's not what we're about. But that's what it's become. That's what you're describing. And that's why it's a relapse into barbarism. Now, what will the Iranians do? Well, what would you do? I would fight back with everything at my disposal. And I would punish, absolutely annihilate everything and anyone who stands with us. So if you're living in Kuwait or Bahrain or Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, or for that matter, even Saudi Arabia, I would get ready, because if you think you're going to escape the consequences of Trump's war and Israel's demand for Iran's destruction, you will not. And the elites that are ruling in those countries will be swept out of power. They've already reached out to Jordan, and I'm sure that they have thousands of weapons and missiles remaining that they will ultimately use against Israel. And there's not a great deal we can do. We cannot shut that down. And we've talked about this before. Our technology, as Ted Postal and others have pointed out, has not reached the point where we can reliably protect any of these places. The smart move, the intelligent move, is to recognize the limits of our power, to recognize the futility, and say, that's enough. No more. We wish you well, Israel, but we cannot go on with this campaign. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Well, there isn't anybody else out there that wants anything to do with this war. That's what we need to understand. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, all these people are disinterested in this war. They want it to end. We're the only ones that are talking about war. When you go to Asia, you go to these conferences. Hegseth was just over there and talked about China. Everybody in the audience is looking at him like this man's lost his mind. They're not interested in going to war with China, neither the Koreans or the Japanese or anybody else. And now that we've demonstrated that we can't protect anybody because we just don't have the technology to do it, the question is going to be, why are we still in Korea? Why are we still in Japan? We can't protect anybody. If we can't protect somebody, then we're a magnet for trouble. We're a catalyst for conflict. And the sad part is that President Trump instinctively understood this during his first term, and he was thinking in the right terms. But if you don't have a foundation of knowledge and understanding, you can be talked out of things that make sense in favor of things that don't. There's nothing firm that you can base your decision-making on. And I think that's his biggest problem. So right now he is bullying his way forward, hoping that something will happen, something will break. The idea that Suez could be shut down is not a new one. And frankly speaking, even though it's still useful to the states like Saudi Arabia and others, it's not what it was because of the Houthi operation. I was reading the other day, because I've had to understand the oil industry, and people that have looked at this industry since these things began said the same thing. None of it has ever recovered. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz. It's access to the Red Sea. It's access and movement through the Suez. All of these places are suffering. What you're doing is you're taking a patient that's already on life support, frankly, in a purely fiscal, economic sense, and you're killing them. You're disconnecting them, and you're putting at least 1 billion people or more on this planet at great risk. You're making famine inevitable. You're stopping the delivery of food. Everything that you can think of that is bad is inevitably coming about because of this stupidity of making war against Iran on behalf of Israel. That's it. And it needs to stop. The sooner it stops, the better off we will all be. Our world is not going to end, and armies of Islamist radicals are not going to march into the United States. Well, short term, they're catastrophic. People are not going to simply see prices rise at the gas tank. Everything is going to be more expensive because we understand that petroleum figures prominently in everything that we live on in modern civilization. It fuels your trucks. It enables packaging, plastics. We could go on and on. So we know that's catastrophic. I think the question is, have we stopped exporting all crude? Have we stopped exporting any refined products like gasoline or diesel? I don't know. I need to check on that. We really need to know that. I think if we haven't, we will. And we have exported a great deal to Japan as well as to Great Britain. Great Britain is in terrible shape right now. And the fools in the British government have prohibited any more exploration and drilling in the North Sea, even though they know right off the coast of Scotland, they've got huge quantities of oil there. This should have been exploited a long time ago. They did not believe in building a cushion. There was no sense of the need to guard against insecurity that erupts in a way that's unanticipated. So it's not just us. It's also Europe and especially Great Britain. Germany is very close to the bottom. France is not far behind, except the French at least have had the good sense to maintain their nuclear capability, and that's helped a great deal. But I think we're going to see a lot of upheaval, particularly in Western Europe, as all of the things that you and I are describing begin to have an impact. And of course, there's the Russians. They're happy to do business, but they sure as hell are not going to do business with people that continue to arm the Ukrainians. And essentially, when we say Ukrainians, that's a misnomer. How many troops do the Ukrainians really have in the field? The latest casualty figures that I've seen are just disastrous. Every time they put something into the field, the Russians kill it. It's like a giant lawnmower that's moving across, and every day it goes further and further and further. Pretty soon they're going to run out of grass to mow. And I think that's what's happening in Ukraine. Nobody seems to be concerned about that. That would help a lot if we ended that, but no one wants to do it. Look, Dan, this is frustrating for me because remember when we were in the Gulf, there was this exchange between General Freddie Franks, who was a 7th Corps commander, and he was speaking to 3 or 4 non-commissioned officers. One was a staff sergeant. And he was whining on, I just don't want to see anybody die. I don't want anything bad to happen. Finally, this sergeant, disgusted with what he was hearing, and rightly so, said, you know, General, we knew the job was dangerous when we took it. And I hate to be blunt about this, but if you are going to be Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, yes, your life is at risk. It's always at risk. Get used to it. That's part of the deal, as he would say. So I don't know what the excitement is over his potential demise, but if he lives or dies, that is not supposed to decisively shape the future of the United States. He just happens to be president at the moment. We need to stop this discussion completely. And anybody who stands up and says, well, if we find any connection between the people that killed the president, if such a thing should happen, we'll go ahead and destroy wherever they're from. We'll annihilate. That's absurd. That's complete nonsense. And it leads you into stupid acts. The dumbest one that springs immediately to mind was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria, the crown prince, frankly, who was going to replace the Austrian emperor. You didn't have to invade Serbia. Invading Serbia wasn't going to change anything. It certainly wasn't going to bring anybody back to life. And punishing an entire population wasn't going to endear you to them. It's just stupid. We need to get out of this. And Trump is out of touch with reality. I don't think that's news for anybody. I think it very much is. And quite frankly, his ego has reached new levels of irrationality. So I'm very uncomfortable talking about that. I think we ought to shut up about it. And we ought to understand that people right now are very emotional in Iran, and that's understandable. And we're going to hear these kinds of things. But we've got to get out of the business of figuring out how to sustain hatred, how to sustain violence, how to extend violence, and look at what we can do to bring an end to it. How do we stop it? Because if this continues on the current path, eventually others will be drawn in. And everybody says, well, Doug, explain how that happens. Well, I don't actually know. I can't say with absolute certainty what would bring in other great powers. But it would be a serious mistake to think that everyone will ultimately sit by and do nothing in perpetuity. Let's not tempt fate. Anyway, I'm sorry to get on my soapbox, but I find this really distasteful, this kind of nonsense. There's several points. The first is No one should delude themselves into believing that these kinds of strikes are going to rescue Ukraine from defeat, that this is going to turn around the war. That's all nonsense. Ukraine is doomed to destruction, sadly. And the second part of this is that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of relative indefensible targets at sea in the Russian Navy. This goes back to some of the discussions we had recently when we were talking with Joe Kent. The Russians have learned a great deal. Their ground forces adapted brilliantly. If you look at what's happening along the front line of troops, where the edge of the battle is and where things are happening, the Russian troops have clearly learned how to cope with these unmanned systems. And instead of rushing in and executing these encirclements, what they call cauldron battles, in the space of 2 or 3 days, it takes 10 days to 2 weeks because they want to avoid unnecessary casualties. And they know that the people that they're fighting have no chance. So it's very deliberate, it's very methodical, and it works. And they're ultimately destroying more and more and more ashore. What they haven't done is looked at the reality in the Black Sea. And when you go into these ports in Crimea or anywhere along the coast of the Black Sea that's Russian, it's very hard to protect these vessels that are sitting at anchor. And as they close with Ukraine, that is, they move in proximity to where these weapons are being launched from, it's harder and harder to protect them. They need to adjust things there. I think some heads are going to roll in the Russian naval forces. If I were going to predict anything, I think that's an absolute certainty, because this sort of business shouldn't happen. But finally, we need to understand that eventually this is going to end. And it's going to end with Russia in control of Odessa. It's going to end with Russia in control of Kharkov. It's going to end with Russian control of this thing they call Novorossiya. The Russians are not interested in owning Western Ukraine. They want it to be neutral. They don't want it to be another assembly point for future operations against them, which is exactly what we've done with it. And that's why they don't trust us anymore. That's why they're not going to really talk to us seriously. At least this administration has no chance of reaching them. And I think the Western globalists that are behind all this are being ignored. If they keep it up, then yes, they could be at risk of many things. But right now, the Russians want to finish this business in eastern Ukraine once and for all. And that will involve taking Odessa. When they decide to do this is something I can't predict with certainty, but it will happen.